The humans ate the piece, and boy, silence fell over the Galactic Council chamber. Representatives from 100 species, some breathing through gills, others wrapped in exoskeletal plating, all turned to stare at the hulking form of High Arbitrator Vexil. His 6 compound eyes twitched, mandibles clicking as he replayed the words in his mind, hoping he had misheard. He had not. A holographic recording confirmed it. The envoy, a delicate, avian-bodied Selene diplomat, had approached the human delegation on the war-scorched moon of Erix 9, where the negotiations were set to begin. He had offered the ceremonial fruit of unity, an act of goodwill practiced for millennia. The humans had taken the fruit, studied it, nodded their thanks. Then they had produced their own offering, roasted meat. The Selene had hesitated, politely declining with a few chirps. The humans had insisted. A misunderstanding had blossomed into something worse when a human, identified as Captain Elias Brandt, had clapped the Selene on the back, grinned, and bit into his own serving of food with an audible crunch. The Selene, whose species bore an unfortunate resemblance to the meat in question, had dropped dead from shock. The recording cut off and the chamber erupted into chaos. Shouts, screeches and hisses filled the air. A representative of the crush, a towering reptilian with glistening black scales, slammed his claws into the table. The humans mocked the sacred rights of diplomacy. This cannot stand. Ambassador Roth, the human representative, sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. This is ridiculous. Vexil recoiled. Ridiculous? A diplomatic envoy has perished. Roth waved a hand. From fear, not from violence. If your diplomat had a condition that made him collapse at the sight of grilled food, that should have been in his medical file. The Selene do not consume flesh. The shrill voice of a Zari delegate pierced through the air. And yet the humans, barbarians that they are, offered it as a gift. Roth shrugged. We eat meat. We thought it would be polite. In many cultures, sharing food is a gesture of trust. A clicking chuff came from the back of the room. Trust? The voice belonged to a Varick warrior, his armour bristling with battle scars. The humans share food as a gesture of trust, and yet they never question what is handed to them. Roth leaned forward. You're saying we should have assumed the fruit was poisoned. The Varick warrior tilted his head. I am saying that if a creature unfamiliar to you handed you something, would you eat it without hesitation? A murmur spread through the council. The realization dawned. You do not fear, the crush whispered. Roth smirked. Not particularly. Vexil's mandibles quivered. You misunderstand. It is not a compliment. It is a warning. His 6 eyes narrowed. Do you not comprehend the scope of what we discuss here? You lack the basic instincts that govern all other sapient life. No rational species would so casually eat an unknown substance. Rykov drummed his fingers on the table. We've got medics, antitoxins and stomach pumps. If it goes wrong, we fix it. Most things that would kill you just make us sick for a few days. We adapt. The crush let out a low growl. That is not adaptation. That is recklessness. Roth sighed. We call it resilience. The murmuring grew louder. Some species looked at the humans with newfound respect. Others with deepening horror. Vexil exhaled slowly. This council was called to determine if humanity is a threat. I no longer believe that question needs answering. His voice grew solemn. You do not fear the unknown. You do not hesitate in the face of danger. And worst of all, he turned to face Rykov directly, you clearly missed the memo. Roth blinked. Memo? Vexil gestured to the chamber at large. Every species here evolved to survive. Every species here learned that caution preserves life. Every species here follows the natural laws of preservation. His mandibles twitched. But you ignore them. You rush forward when others flee. You laugh at warnings that keep others alive. A sudden silence filled the chamber. Roth exhaled. You're saying we're different. Vexil nodded. More than different. You are dangerous. The room's temperature seemed to drop. The Zari, Krush, Varak, and a dozen other species exchanged glances, some with caution, some with something deeper. Roth met the stares evenly. So, what happens now? Vexil's mandibles clicked once more. Now, we reconsider everything. The chamber had grown eerily quiet, the weight of Vexil's words settling over the gathered species like a thick fog. Humanity was dangerous, not because they wielded the most advanced weaponry or commanded the largest fleets, but because they lacked something every other species had, an instinct for self-preservation. Ambassador Roth rolled his shoulders, letting the silence stretch a moment longer before speaking. Reconsider everything sounds dramatic. What exactly are we reconsidering? Vexil's compound eyes reflected the dim glow of the chamber's hollow displays. Whether humanity can be trusted to exist among us without destabilizing everything. That stirred another wave of murmuring. Some voices were hushed, uncertain. Others, like the crushed delegates, rumbled with something closer to anger. We let them into the council because we assumed they followed the same basic survival instincts as the rest of us. His voice was low, but his words carried weight. That assumption was clearly flawed. Roth chuckled, shaking his head. You're talking like we're rabid animals. Perhaps you are, the Zari delegate shot back. His species, thin and sinewy, had evolved in dense, predator-infested jungles. Survival was second nature to them. You do not behave as any rational species should. Roth tilted his head. Define rationale. The Zari's ridged brow furrowed. A rational species does not consume unknown substances without verifying their safety. A rational species does not smile in the face of danger. A rational species... Roth raised a hand. I get it. We don't react the way you expect. He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. Maybe you should be asking why. The chamber fell silent again. The Varak warrior, who had been watching the discussion with a glint of curiosity, folded his arms. Explain. Roth exhaled. Look, I get why you think we're reckless, but you're assuming we don't understand risk. We do. We just approach it differently. He gestured vaguely. Take your example about eating unknown food. Sure, we don't always hesitate, but that's because we've built systems to deal with the consequences. Our bodies can handle more than most. And if that fails, we rely on medicine. We take the hit, adapt, and move forward. The Zari's eyes narrowed. And what of your reckless disregard for death? Roth blinked. What disregard? Vexil interjected, his voice heavy. It is not merely about food or fear responses. Your entire species operates under an unnatural absence of caution. You engage in combat at the slightest provocation. You charge into battles even when outnumbered. Your soldiers have been observed continuing to fight after suffering injuries that would incapacitate any other being. And when presented with the possibility of death, your kind either shrugs it off or laughs. The crushed delegate's claws drummed against the table. I have seen humans fight. I have seen them bleed and yet refuse to fall. That is not natural. Raykov sighed. Look, we're not some mindless berserkers. We don't have a death wish. He paused. But if you're asking why we don't hesitate, it's because hesitation gets you killed. The Varak warrior let out a low hum, considering. You do not hesitate because you cannot afford to. Raykov nodded. Exactly. He leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. I don't know how it was for your species, but for us. We didn't evolve in stable conditions. We weren't the biggest, fastest, or strongest creatures on our planet. We were prey before we were predators. The only reason we survived is because we learned to push forward, no matter what. He gestured toward the assembled council. Most species reach a point where they no longer need to fight to survive. You build your cities, advance your technology, and eventually the struggle fades. His gaze sharpened. For us, it never faded. We just got better at surviving. The chamber was deathly quiet now. The crushed delegate bared his teeth. That is why you do not fear. Roth exhaled through his nose. It's not that we don't feel fear. We just don't let it stop us. A long silence stretched between them. The gathered representatives exchanged looks, some uncertain, others contemplative. Finally, Vexil spoke again. So this is what you are, then. A species that rushes headlong into danger, not because you fail to understand it, but because you refuse to let it dictate your actions. Rykov met his gaze. Sounds about right. The Varak warrior let out a deep, rumbling laugh. Now I see why your kind thrives in war. The crushed delegate grunted. It is not only war where this trait manifests. Even in peace they move too fast, push too hard. Vexil's mandibles clicked in thought. Perhaps this is why humans have disrupted galactic politics so quickly. Other species proceed with caution, weighing every risk. You simply act. Rykov shrugged. Not like the galaxy waits around for permission. The chamber was quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence now, less fearful, more thoughtful. Vexil's eyes flickered toward his fellow council members. This discussion is far from over, but one thing is clear. He turned back to Roth. We cannot treat you as we do other species. You're something else entirely. Rykov smirked. You're just figuring that out now. The council chamber remained silent, the weight of realization pressing down on every delegate present. The humans were different, fundamentally, dangerously different. Vexil studied Roth, mandibles twitching in thought. You say you do not let fear dictate your actions, that you push forward regardless of risk. I begin to understand why your kind is difficult to control. Roth's expression was unreadable. Control. Was that ever the goal? The crushed delegate exhaled through flared nostrils. Every species that joins the Council integrates into the greater order. We provide guidance, structure. Yet humanity does not integrate. It reshapes. His claws tapped against the table. You do not follow the rules. You make your own. Roth sighed. Look, we're not here to tear down your way of doing things. We just don't think like you do. And maybe that's a good thing. The Varak warrior let out another amused chuckle. Perhaps, or perhaps it is what will bring the downfall of this council. Vexil's gaze remained fixed on Roth. Do you even realize the disruption your presence has caused? Roth met his stare evenly. You mean because we don't hesitate? Because we take risks? No, Vexil said, his voice low. Because you make others question why they don't. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Slowly, some of the delegates exchanged glances. They had always followed the same patterns, the same rules of caution, diplomacy, careful advancement. But then humans arrived, charging into battles they should have avoided, consuming food without hesitation, forging alliances with species others had feared. And they thrived. The realization was unsettling. The crushed delegate's voice was quieter now, more thoughtful. For millennia, we have called caution wisdom. We have called patience strength. And yet humans, he trailed off, you defy every assumption. Roth leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. Maybe that's a good thing. Vexil's mandibles clicked. Or maybe it is a threat to everything we have built. The Zari delegate, who had been among the most critical of humanity, shifted in his seat. Then what do we do with them? A long pause. The Varak warrior's voice was calm, steady. We adapt. The response sent a ripple through the chamber. Vexil studied the warrior with all 6 of his compound eyes. Adapt? The Varak nodded. Humans do not fear risk because they have mastered surviving it. They do not hesitate because hesitation has never served them. He exhaled slowly. Perhaps it is time we stop viewing them as reckless and begin to see them as something to learn from. Roth's smirk returned. Took you long enough? Vexil's mandibles twitched in irritation, but he could not deny the truth of the words. Humanity had forced the galaxy to reconsider everything it believed about survival, strength, and progress. They did not fear the unknown, and in doing so, they changed how others saw it too. The crushed delegate's claws tapped against the table once more, this time slower. A motion, then. Vexil straightened. State it. The Crush's reptilian gaze flicked toward Rykov. That humanity remains within the Council, not as a disruptive force, but as a catalyst for growth. A murmur spread through the chamber. Some species hesitated, but others nodded. Vexil took a slow breath, before turning to Roth. And what do you propose, Ambassador? If we are to accept that your kind does not abide by the same instincts as others, what then is your place among us? Roth's smirk softened, replaced by something more serious. We don't want to rule. We don't want to break the system. We just want to be part of it, our way. We'll take risks, push boundaries, and sometimes drive you all crazy. He glanced around the room. But we'll also be the first ones to stand beside you when things go wrong, because that's who we are. Silence. Then the Varak warrior stood, his heavy armour clanking as he turned to face the Council. I accept humanity among us. One by one others rose, the crushed delegate, the Zari, even Vexil, though his mandibles twitched with reluctance. Rykov simply leaned back in his chair, a small, satisfied grin on his face. Because deep down he had always known how this would end. Humanity was here to stay, and the galaxy would never be the same. The Galactic Council chamber was quiet long after the vote had been cast. The momentous decision had been made. Humanity was not an outlier to be feared, but a force to be understood. Yet, as the chamber emptied, a few figures remained, their minds still turning over the implications of what had transpired. Ambassador Roth stood at the edge of the great chamber, looking over the intricate symbols etched into the walls. They represented civilizations far older than humanity, species that had shaped the stars long before his kind had even understood fire. And yet today, those ancient species had acknowledged that the newcomers, fragile, impulsive, and audacious, had something to offer. You're thinking too much. Rykov turned to see the towering form of the Varak warrior, arms crossed over his plated chest. His kind had been among the first to recognize humanity's potential, not as a mistake of evolution, but as an anomaly that forced others to adapt. I do that sometimes, Rykov said. Call it a flaw. The Varak warrior let out a dry laugh. If it were a flaw, your species would not have made it this far. We fight with strength. You fight with momentum. That is why you survive. Rykov nodded. And now we've changed things, for better or worse. A new voice entered the conversation, this one a low, deliberate click. Vexil approached, his insectoid frame moving with precise calculation. You say that as if there is uncertainty in the outcome. Rykov sighed. Because there is. The vote went in our favour, but that doesn't mean everyone is happy about it. Some of them are still afraid of us. And fear can be dangerous. Vexil's mandibles twitched. Perhaps. But fear also forces progress. For centuries we have operated under the assumption that caution is the guiding principle of civilization. Humanity has shown that survival is not merely a matter of avoiding risk, but knowing when to take it. Rykov studied the insectoid diplomat carefully. Of all those in the chamber, Vexel had been the most resistant to humanity's acceptance. To hear him now speaking of change rather than opposition was a testament to how much had already shifted. The crushed delegate joined them, his scaled form moving with slow precision. "This will not be an easy path," he warned. "The Council may have accepted your kind, but that does not mean the rest of the galaxy will. Some will resist, others will see you as an opportunity. You have opened the door to something none of us can predict." Roth exhaled. "We're used to that." The Varak warrior tilted his head. "Then I suspect your people will thrive." Vexel considered the words before nodding. "Perhaps. Or perhaps we will all be forced to keep up." Roth turned to face them fully. "Then let's make sure that whatever comes next, we all move forward together." The Galactic Council had voted to accept humanity, but the real test was just beginning.